Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of December, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me by video link today are Charles Malet and Vanessa Beeley. Later in the programme, we're going to be covering the Grooming Gangs inquiry, BBC coverage of Jolani's first anniversary as president of Syria, and a host of other topics. But we're going to get started today, Charles, with digital ID.
We are, and good afternoon, Mike. Good afternoon, all. And the reason for this is because a petition which was signed by 3 million people and sent to the Houses of Parliament has been dealt with. We'll first of all address what happened in October, which was the government's response to the nearly 3 million people that did sign it. And they said, despite the petition, we will introduce a digital ID within this Parliament to help tackle illegal migration, making accessing government services easier and to enable wider efficiency. So effectively, the message being that you're going to have it whether you like it or not. They went on in this response to the petition by saying that it was really the complexity, the supposed complexity of dealing with physical documents. And they said this is both bureaucratic for the individual and creates space for abuse and fraud. So they were on very thin ice at the beginning. But what we'll do is we'll just go back to listen to the words of one of the chief architects of this initiative, going right back to his term in office as Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
The benefits are clear. Digital ID will make our interactions with each other and with the state faster, cheaper, and more reliable. It will allow us to judge who has a right to be in our country and who doesn't, and so solves one of the major challenges of immigration. Facial recognition can now spot suspects in real time from live video, tracking organized criminals at borders, in public spaces, even helping find missing people. In London, live facial recognition led to 360 arrests by the Met Police between January and October 2024, just in a pilot project. It boosts response times and helps identify suspects quickly in busy places like train stations and events. Live video from body cams and CCTVs can be used to provide real-time advice to officers from a command center or deploy resources to where they're most needed. AI will go even further, spotting crime patterns, guiding patrols, and streamlining decisions. This is where technology, like digital ID, becomes critical. My institute's own analysis shows that introducing this in the UK would save at least $2 billion a year and likely more by reducing losses to fraud, improving tax collection, and better targeting of state support. We can ensure that digital ID enhances rather than threatens personal privacy. The key is building trust and designing, with thought and intention, systems that are secure, fair, inclusive, and effective at combating crime and making us all safer.
Not the most convincing of salesmen, one might say, and certainly had he been taking part in the debate in Westminster Hall on Monday, he might have found himself in a minority, but nonetheless, he puts forward the official narrative position. Now, leading that debate was Robbie Moore, MP, Conservative MP, and here he is just in an early engagement and with another contribution from Neil Hudson, also Conservative MP.
And Sir Edward, there lies all of the explanations and the reasoning as to why there is so many in this House that are opposed to the plans that are being brought forward by the Prime Minister. But here's the question they hope that nobody will ask. If the real target is people who are here illegally, then why on earth do 67 million British citizens who already have national insurance numbers, passports, driving licences and birth certificates need to be dragged into a brand new compulsory database as well? What exactly is it about stopping the crisis of inflatable dinghies in the Channel that requires your son, your daughter, your dad, your 90-year-old grandma to hand over her data and facial geometry to the Home Office server? And I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. My constituents in Epping Forest are deeply concerned about the prospect of digital ID cards. Many have written and spoken to me, and over 5,600 have signed the petition. Rather than improving the delivery of public services, this scheme actually risks wasting billions on a complex, intrusive and potentially very insufficient insecure system that will not help anyone. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the Labour government must listen now, take on board the public concerns and scrap this flawed policy?
And my honourable friend makes an absolute point, because the reason is this is not about stopping the boats at all. This is about more government state control. I will give
Moore and Hudson there expressing concern about state control. One might ask where the voices like those were in 2020, but going on to the specific migration issue, this is what Damien Hinds, another Conservative MP, had to say.
One of them. But Italy has ID cards. It also has one of the highest rates of illegal arrivals by sea in the world. And here, employers are obliged already to do identity and right to work checks. And by the way, if you sign up as a legally resident person to deliver food and then subcontract that job to somebody here illegally for cash, I fail to see how an ID card or a digital ID interferes with that at all. Now, ministers say there would be no penalty for not carrying a card and there would be no stop and search, but it's very hard to see how digital ID or physical ID cards address illegal immigration unless it is possible to demand the card from somebody who you find in the street or in a workplace. And that is precisely the papers, please society that we do not want.
And he would appear to be absolutely right on that point about the papers, please. And effectively, has he caught the government in a lie there by when they declare that people would not be required to produce their identity? Now, this did bring in voices from all across the spectrum. And in fact, we had former sparring partners Ian Duncan-Smith and Jeremy Corbyn in an exchange, again, pursuing yet more dimensions to the very many problems with this.
A very good case. I am utterly opposed to this, as are many of my constituents. But one of them has made this point to me, that in actual fact, our great liberty, our great freedom, that the state has to prove you guilty before you have to make a charge. So innocence before guilt. This reverses that, such that almost everybody on an ID card is assumed to have guilt until they have discharged themselves as innocent. Doesn't that break against all our freedoms?
I thank the member for the intervention. I think he's making an important point there, because the huge numbers that have signed this petition indicate to me that there are many in this country that are deeply concerned of the direction of travel in which we're going. ID cards is one thing. Restricting jury trial is another. Facial recognition at tube stations and now even in supermarkets is something that people find deeply disturbing. There's a whole vein of thought across the country where people are feeling a quite reasonable sense of paranoia about the levels of surveillance under which they're under at the present time. And I think members of Parliament would do well to try and understand that this attack on civil liberties, and that's what it is, means that vast amounts of information, utterly vast amounts of information on all of us will be stored, as they are already within the health service, which unfortunately the government is now making available to private healthcare interests at the same time. So there's a huge issue here about our data, our information and our privacy, which I think we would do well to remember. The last point I want to make is this. This debate is being pushed by commercial interests. Commercial interests who will make a great deal of money out of providing the necessary technical equipment to set up this surveillance system, that will do very well out of it, and we are being pushed into agreeing it by them. I think it's time for members of Parliament to say, listen to what people are saying, listen to the concerns, have a proper debate in the chamber about this, and say no to the government, as we've said no before.
Corbyn just making the point there that he did earlier on, in fact, that it should have been in the main chamber. And this seems like a deliberate attempt by the government to further marginalise. And also the critical point is that all these views represented, or at least brought out by MPs, have come directly from their constituents. Now, the other thing to point out is that it should be seen as no coincidence that the Council of Europe today are meeting to discuss migration and the European Convention on Human Rights, which of course goes to the heart of the matter that Jeremy Corbyn was concluding with there, which is the issue of privacy. Now, it was back in 2011 as the Identity Cards Act 2006 was repealed by the 2010 Act, and the National Identity Register was supposedly destroyed. And of course, that leaves currently the situation that the minister may not issue identity card. So it would be illegal to do so. But of course, we just have to conclude by pointing towards the Government One login site, which is in effect creating a national identity register by stealth, because as they say, over time, the One login will replace all other ways to sign into services on gov.uk. So really a debate during which many of the pitfalls and very obvious sort of red herrings were brought out into the open, but there should be continued pressure applied to this. But it must be seen, despite the government's reaction to the petition itself, it should be seen as a positive step in terms of engagement. Mike, I don't know if you've got any comments to sort of follow that report.
Not really at this stage. We'll talk about this in extra, I've no doubt. But let's move on then to the news yesterday, which was that the death of a British Special Forces serviceman in what the Ministry of Defence called a tragic accident. It's widely reported that hostile fire is not thought to have been reported, to be involved, and the term that was used in the media was not thought, so I'm not sure whether there's absolute clarity on that. The question which hasn't been answered precisely is what he was doing there. The statement said he was injured in a tragic accident while observing Ukrainian forces test a new defensive capability away from the front lines. So whatever that means, Charles, let me just ask you very briefly what your thoughts are on that news.
Well, with so little detail, I should just clarify. You said special forces, but I think you meant to say armed forces. I don't think there's any evidence at this stage that there is a special forces. It was
reported in mainstream press that it was special forces.
That it was special forces.
Yes.
Well, the engagement with Ukraine on the training and mentoring basis goes back a number of years, and by from the very small amount of information that has been put forward, I think it's very difficult to say what the circumstances could be. I mean, after all, personnel are killed in training incidents and accidents, I'm afraid, all throughout the year. And so this may have been one such. It does seem unusual that there have been so few recorded, and therefore perhaps there is more to this than we know now. But I mean, beyond that, I don't think I can really make much comment.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Now, Starmer on Monday hosted Zelensky, French President Macron, German Chancellor Merz, all at Downing Street. Now, the readout that they published says that they discussed the importance of the US-led peace talks for European security and supported the progress made. I'm just going to say that's rubbish. They're deeply worried that the US is leaving them to it. And it goes on to say that they instructed their national security advisor to continue discussions over the coming days. And it said that they underscored the need for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which includes robust security guarantees. So look, let's have a quick listen to what Starmer said during the press conference.
The principles remain the principles that we've been raised on for a very, very long time, which is that we stand with Ukraine, and if there's to be a ceasefire, it needs to be a just and lasting ceasefire. And that's why it's so important that we repeatedly set out the principle that matters about Ukraine are for Ukraine, and we stand here to support you in the conflict and support you in the negotiations, and make sure that this is a just and lasting settlement if we can get that far.
If we can get that far. So in other words, no intention of heading towards peace at all. But following that little meeting, Starmer hosted a call with other European allies, as they described it, alongside Zelensky, to give them all an update and to get general agreement on keeping the war going. And Zelensky announced that they would be sharing a new agenda. They described it as a 20-point plan with Trump. Yes, and they were planning on doing that yesterday. This seems to be a response to Trump's proposals for peace that he sent to them and also to Russia. But they're absolutely not budging on giving up territory to Russia. Zelensky said once again that Ukraine cannot give up any land. He said the mood of the Americans in principle is for finding a compromise. Of course, there are complex issues related to territory, and a compromise has not yet been found there. So the other issue is that there's no general agreement. The readout suggested that there was. But let's bring on Slovak President Peter Pellegrini here. He said that the European Union's military aid and support for Ukraine is only prolonging the conflict in with Russia. And he said that the EU should accelerate and support US efforts so that their representatives can sit down at the negotiating table with Putin as soon as possible and end the fighting. But I would suggest that that's not what we're seeing. So you could look at it that Trump is doing a good job in appearing to warm up relations with Putin, particularly with the recent release of the new national security strategy, which Russia seems to be viewing very positively. But we need to remember what Trump's stated goal was. This was stated before he was elected, that Europe needs to deal with European affairs while the US moves on to other theatres of operation. And I say this because although Pete Hegseth is coming under massive pressure over possible war crimes, as Patrick was reporting on Friday's news programme, the Trump regime is moving ahead with the whole Venezuela war effort. It seems the Washington Times here is reporting that they have stood up a US Army Western Hemisphere Command, which they're saying is unifying the domestic response missions currently performed by the US Army North, the Latin America and Caribbean focused operations of the US Army South, and the large-scale readiness oversight from the US Army Forces Command. So this is all going to be merged together. I just want to highlight here an interview with The Guardian published on Monday with the Brazilian chief foreign policy advisor. And he was saying that he was afraid that the Venezuela conflict would worsen in the coming weeks, the potential of US Venezuelan conflict. And he said he was speaking for himself, not for Lula, but he said that the last thing we want for South America is to become a war zone. And a war zone that would inevitably not just be a war between the US and Venezuela, it would end up having global involvement. And this would be really unfortunate. And he said if there was an invasion, a real invasion, I think undoubtedly you would see something similar to Vietnam. On quite what scale, it's impossible to say. But he also suggested that in the event of a US invasion of Venezuela, some nations that oppose Maduro, even those would get involved. He said, I know South America, our whole continent exists because of resistance against foreign invaders. And a US invasion of Venezuela would rekindle anti-American sentiment around the continent. So the situation then remains pretty volatile. The war policy is absolutely in full swing in Europe, driven by the UK, and the US is clearly pivoting to other theatres of operation. That's how it looks to me anyway. Vanessa, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with journalist Diego Sequeira yesterday, who doesn't actually believe, he thinks that this is massive amplification of this war narrative. If war does go ahead against Venezuela, of course, Brazil and Colombia become very vulnerable. And if they fall, if Venezuela falls, basically, which nobody thinks it's going to right now, then the whole of Latin America is threatened. So I think it's more a policy of containment and encirclement of Venezuela, and a similar hybrid war that's going on right now in West Asia or the Middle East.
This is a pretty unpleasant scenario for the people there and for South America. I mean, why would we got to keep asking why there would be support for this, particularly when it's absolutely clear that Maduro is not. Venezuela is not a narco state. Maduro is not supporting the drug trafficking, in contrast to other South American countries.
Yeah, I mean, these narratives like weapons of mass destruction, narco state, we know that they're generated basically by the CIA, and of course that the US is consistently profiting from any kind of drug cartel activity. And not forgetting, of course, that they levied that accusation against President Assad for the Captagon smuggling and production, and claimed that he was running a narco state in the last 18 months of his governance of Syria. Now, of course, we see that it's exponentially growing as an industry in Syria, even though Assad is no longer there.
Indeed. Well, let's move on to Syria then, because it's a year since the Assad government fell. So what's the latest?
Well, the latest is that the BBC is shoring up their 14 years of wall-to-wall propaganda to bring about regime change. But sort of, in my view, this is quite extraordinary. The scenes that we're seeing from inside Damascus, yes, it's 1 year. It's 1 year since I left Syria after the terrorist groups took over Damascus, and the BBC are back there in force, which for me does raise questions as to why. So let's have a look at the BBC reporting. First of all, this is the front page of their website. They, of course, pretty much the massacres that are being carried out against Syrian minorities are very much a sort of a reduced narrative within the articles themselves. And they're very clearly supporting Jolani as an unelected Syrian president with his al-Qaeda roots. So victory only the start, Syrian president says the year after the toppling of Assad. So they very much verbatim repeat what Jolani is saying and give it credence and legitimacy, just as they have done, of course, throughout the war against Syria. And here again, just part of the main page. Again, if you freeze it and just read some of the commentary there, all of it is pretty supportive of Jolani. Very little of it is actually focused on the war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed with Jolani's green light since 1 year ago. And if we look at who's actually on the ground in Syria, this is what I found very interesting. So you have here Hugo Bachega, Lise Doucet, Jeremy Bowen, Lena Sinjab. Well, Lise Doucet and Jeremy Bowen are two of the most senior reporters at the BBC. In my view, having had a conversation with Lise Doucet in Damascus some years ago, I would say very well connected into the intelligence agencies in the UK. Why would you have four senior correspondents in one place? I mean, did we see this at after the fall of Iraq or after the fall of Libya? I don't think so. So let's have a look at what they're actually saying. So international editor Jeremy Bowen. By the way, they're both promoting a release of books. So they're both on a book tour also of the region. In Damascus, reported Syria's interim president, Jolani, has found the going easier abroad than at home, where people still live in skeletal buildings gutted by war. Lise Doucet noted that Jolani donned the same kind of military fatigues he wore when his forces last year stormed into the capital, Damascus. And while many Syrians say a weight has been lifted, he spoke to a country still marred by sectarian violence. This is this passive-aggressive byline here. So it's like saying 100 Palestinians were killed without saying they were killed by Israel. And they're pushing effectively, just as they were pushing for a no-fly zone during the regime change war, now they're pushing for the lifting of sanctions through the narratives that they're producing. And I just wanted to show this little clip of Lise Doucet in Damascus while there are ongoing massacres in Syria, looking very jolly and not only talking about Jolani, the success of Jolani and of the so-called revolution, but also promoting the BBC. So let's just have a quick look.
Syrians are celebrating again in the iconic Umayyad Square in the heart of Damascus. They surged into this area a year ago to celebrate the end of decades of dictatorship and a brutal civil war. There are so many stories to tell, and you can hear many of them on the BBC's From Our Own Correspondent. It's celebrating its birthday on Saturday, 70 years.
I mean, a civil war that was entirely sustained by the likes of Lise Doucet and Jeremy Bowen. And then let's have a look very quickly at the continuing narrative from Lena Sinjab and Hugo Bachega. So basically, here, some minorities remain frightened. Not tens of thousands have been massacred by Jolani. Bachega makes the point that basically they also face huge challenges. One man told him the main game here is freedom, while a young boy talked about how the world's perception of his country had changed. So again, very little focus on the actual crimes that are now becoming commonplace on the streets of all cities and villages across Syria. Jeremy Bowen's main article, Syria feels lighter without the Assad's crushing weight, but now there are new problems. And again, he focuses very much on the economic problems pushing for the lifting of sanctions. And I just wanted to show this video of Jolani during the celebrations. Someone pointed out on X, and I haven't been able to confirm it, that the front man there carrying the machine gun was actually a foreign intelligence operative. But even the fact that Jolani has to be surrounded by these heavily armed security guards, whereas all the footage previously of President Assad mingling with his people, you rarely saw any sign of security at all. Then you have even so-called independent media. This is Mehdi Hassan of Zeteo Media that he's now established. Of course, many people know him as perceptively being pro-Palestine, but in fact, Mehdi Hassan was responsible also for supporting regime change in Syria, which has had a catastrophic effect on the Palestinian resistance and the regional resistance. And then the return of Bana al-Abed, Mike, you will remember this. In Aleppo 2016, she was 5 years old, exploited by the regime change propaganda complex. You'll remember the images of her in Aleppo Stand with Aleppo. She was heavily promoted. I've just completely forgotten her name, the Harry Potter lady. Here she is now in 2025, again promoting the so-called revolution. And of course, when we talk about exploitation, here she is receiving a prize from an organization called Kids' Rights, the Children's Peace Prize. So, of course, she's now been fully absorbed into the soft power complex that will promote Western agendas globally.
Yes, thank you for that, Vanessa. Thanks for that, Vanessa. So J.K. Rowling, of course, is the name that you'd forgotten there. So, but anyway, okay, thank you for that. We'll talk much more about this a little later in Extra. But before we get there, let's just say if you like what the UK Column does and you'd like to support us, you can head over to the UK Column website. There is a link there to take you to a page that explains how you can support us. Join us as a member. You get access to UK Column News Extra. You can make donations and so on. But if you can't do any of that, then please do share material you find on the UK Column website. Now, tonight, 7 p.m., Jerem is speaking to Chloe Carmichael on the dangers of self-censorship. That's at 7. Carl Zah is looking at Macron's visit to China. That's at 9. And tomorrow at 1 p.m., Sandy is speaking to Rachel Matthews on misadventures of an accidental activist. So join us for all those programs over the next little while. But we have just a short message here from Patrick Henningsen.
We're here in Salisbury, and I'm here with our speakers for the event on Thursday night, and we're just kind of having a walk around, a sightseeing tour, as it were, in this incredible historic town of Salisbury. Soon we'll be visiting Salisbury Cathedral with a 123-meter spire. I'm looking forward to that personally. But UK Column's having a fantastic event, but it's about what didn't happen, because we don't know what happened. Nobody seems to know what happened. But I think we know what didn't happen. That's what we're going to be talking about on Thursday night. I hope to see you all there.
So I hope everybody got the joke in that. If you didn't, have a look at last Friday's UK Column News, and maybe you'll understand it then. And of course, the pan across to Sergei Skripal's former property there at the end. Now, if you want the details of tomorrow night's event, it's on Eventbrite. We'll put it on screen now. And the link will be in the show notes if you'd like to attend. There are still some tickets left if you'd like to come to that, 7:30 p.m. If you can't make it to Salisbury, then we will be live streaming the event on the UK Column website. So have a look for that. And then a final, well, not a final reminder yet, but a reminder of Sunday, this coming Sunday, December the 14th, beginning at 6 p.m. The latest, the third annual David Ray Griffin lecture on taking a look at the 9/11 truth movement and where it's at with things. So join us for that beginning at 6 p.m. on Sunday evening. Okay, let's move on then to the issue of grooming gangs. And yesterday, the Home Secretary made a statement in the House of Commons on the appointment of a chair and panel to an inquiry into grooming gangs, or the inquiry into grooming gangs. Let's have a listen to a little bit of what she said.
I know that for many, this day is long overdue. For years, the victims of these awful crimes were ignored. First abused by vile predators, they then found themselves belittled and even blamed when it was justice they were owed. In January, my predecessor asked Baroness Casey of Blackstock, who's here with us today, to conduct a national audit on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. With devastating clarity, Baroness Casey revealed the horror that lies behind that jargonistic term. It is vital that we too call these crimes what they were: multiple sexual assaults committed by multiple men on multiple occasions. Children were submitted to beatings and gang rapes. Many contracted sexually transmitted infections. Some were forced to have abortions. Others had their children taken from them. But it was not just these awful crimes that now shame us. There was also an abject failure by the state in its many forms to fulfill its most basic duty: protecting the young and vulnerable. Worse still, some in positions of power turned a blind eye to the horror, even covered it up. Despite a shameful lack of national data, Baroness Casey was clear that in some local areas where data was available, and I quote, disproportionate numbers of men from Asian ethnic backgrounds were amongst the suspects. Like every member of my community who I know, I am horrified by these acts. We must root out this evil once and for all.
So Mahmood went on to announce that Baroness Anne Longfield, CBE, will lead a 3-year statutory independent inquiry focusing on grooming gangs and looking at ethnicity, religion and culture. Now, Longfield is a former Children's Commissioner who was appointed in 2015 under the previous government, and she'll be leading a 3-person panel. And so these will investigate how young people were failed, this is their language, time and again by the very people who should have protected them. So the other 2 on the panel are Zoe Billingham, CBE, and Eleanor Kelly, CBE. And the inquiry is going to have full legal powers under the Inquiries Act to compel witnesses to give evidence and to require organisations to hand over documents and records and to make recommendations both locally and nationwide, they say, to make sure that nothing like this happens again. Well, you'll excuse my cynicism. We'll explain why in a second. Now, coming back to the final comment in the clip we just saw, frankly, Mahmood has no intention of rooting out the evil of child abuse in this country, because I believe this is about using the victims of these gangs as pawns in a game designed to create ethnic tensions in the UK, because, as we're going to see in a minute, it's not just a problem of Muslims. So the fact that the inquiry is focusing on ethnicity, religion and culture, I believe, is deliberate obfuscation. Now, in saying that, I'm in no way attempting to downplay the issue or the injury which has been imposed on the people affected. But if we focus on the issue of religion alone, we're doing a huge, or even this issue of grooming gangs alone, we're doing a huge disservice to the tens of thousands of people affected by the broader child abuse issue in this country, because this is as much a Christian issue as a Muslim one. The Church of England, for example, has never dealt with its record. And if you aren't aware of its past, have a look at this book by Teresa Cooper, Pinned Down, and a host of other information about what the Church of England has been up to in covering this up. In Northern Ireland, as we speak, the Presbyterian Church is trying to avoid its role in covering up abuse within it. And here too, there is no effort at any kind of real inquiry. And of course, we should not forget this man, Jeffrey Epstein, and because this is not just about low-level child abuse. This is something that reaches the very heights of the British establishment. Now, I want to show a very short excerpt from a presentation given at a UK column event held in Telford in 2015. Just have a look at this.
Gentlemen, what you are looking at on screen is the elephant in the room, the obvious problem. I am, in this case, referring to the data relating to child abuse. Those statistics obtained by the NSPCC cover rape, incest, and child prostitution across all 43 police forces in England and Wales in 2011. One child sex attack was reported every 20 minutes in 2011, equivalent to 444 attacks a week. But fewer than 10% of cases ended in a conviction. 4 years later, it's abundantly clear that the government have remained ineffectual. The headline, the PM dismissive of historic sex abuse claims, could, of course, mean that he is focusing on the present rather than the past. However, the subline is telling. He wants to move on from allegations of sexual abuse involving political figures.
So I've got to make these presentations available. Once again, they haven't been on, at least publicly available since the YouTube channel was originally taken down, because they're more relevant now than they were at the time, I think. And in spite of the potential unpopularity of what I've just said in this report, I'm going to continue to argue that race and religion issue has to be taken out of the discussion around this problem, because the people affected by a grooming gang issue deserve justice, but so does everyone else on the receiving end of child sexual abuse. And that begins with a recognition of the scale of the issue and the fact that this issue reaches into all sections of British society, including Asian grooming gangs, but including Christian churches, schools, nurseries, youth clubs, politicians, the royal family. And remember, at the heart of this is the Children's Home Social Services Complex, which enables it all. And that needs to be looked at as well. So the focus on religion here, I believe, has an ulterior motive. Charles, do you have any brief thoughts on this? I think we're going to talk about this in extra, but any brief thoughts?
Yeah, but I think you're quite right. I mean, the key phrase there from Shabana Mahmood was where data is available, and that's reinforced by the NSPCC's report on this. They wrote a sort of summary of what it is that Casey had said. And of course, in the vast majority of what was reported on, ethnicity was not even known. So this is, an unfortunate skewing. But as you say, there is a direct consequence to that. The other thing to point out in terms of Baroness Longfield, just dealing with other issues that we report on, is that she is a firm and staunch advocate of there being a register for children who are outside of mainstream education. So, it's very interesting who gets brought in to deal with this subject matter, and indeed where this might go for children in a wider context.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for that. Now, Charles, we have a report here from Will Colesill on the Derek Dimmock case. Would you just like to introduce that?
I will. I will prefix it with an apology because, with the Special Forces reference earlier, I'd only read the initial report, but actually I see that you're totally correct. It was Lance Corporal George Hooley of the Parachute Regiment, but specifically one para, which is the Special Forces Support Group. And that is relevant because the Special Forces Support Group, first of all, there was no declaration that they were in Ukraine. And of course, they wouldn't be there if they weren't supporting Special Forces. So that is a sort of an admission in the first instance. Also, it's reported that he and some Ukrainian soldiers died whilst testing an air defense system, which raises the very real question: are British soldiers operating air defense or other equipment that are being aimed at Russia? Therefore, are we actually now seeing that we are directly involved in the conflict? So that just to clarify that point. But yes, Derek Dimmock, we had a report from Will Colesill last week, and this deals with the death of Derek Dimmock in 2020, having been administered to, midazolam, among other things. And so this is the inquiry into what actually did happen. A further report from Will here.
On Friday, I returned to the coroner's court in Suffolk for the last day of the Derek Dimmock inquest. Derek Dimmock was an 86-year-old man who was admitted to Royal Trinity Hospice during June 2020, experiencing severe pain, including by touch. Mr. Dimmock had a history of heart issues and had issues relating to his kidneys. Mr. Dimmock died following the application of midazolam by the NHS at Royal Trinity Hospice, and it's alleged by his family that this caused his death. On Friday, we heard testimony from palliative care expert Professor Sam Ahmedzai, one of the star witnesses in this case, as well as Dr. Daz, another apparent expert witness. Professor Ahmedzai was the doctor who oversaw the creation of the NICE guideline NG31 and is one of the leading world experts in his field of palliative care. Analysing the symptoms of Dell, in particular the uric acid levels of over 800, the professor argued that Dell was indeed suffering from polyarticular gout. He highlighted how Dell's sensitivity to even a stethoscope being placed upon his skin was not merely hyperalgesia and oversensitivity to pain, but the much more severe allodesia, where non-painful interactions lead to pain. The professor argued that this severe pain was most clearly explained by spinal expression of the gout, which can impact nerves, and occurs in roughly a quarter of gout cases despite being often undiagnosed. The professor criticised the lack of hydration given to Dell, which would allow him greater comfort and assist his body in being able to flush out toxins, we heard. Toxins being the side effect of the drugs as they break down and potentially being a lethal combination, to quote the professor, in an individual with renal failure, such as Dell when deprived of hydration. Dell's lack of hydration was noted by Dr. Wright as dehydrated ++, meaning very, very dehydrated. The professor raised alarm that Dell was seemingly not offered any pain relief for 58 minutes, before going on to explain the respiratory suppressant features of midazolam, not present in some other drugs. He questioned why midazolam and not other drugs, such as ketamine, levomeprozamine, were used, which would not have suppressed his respiratory system. The professor analysed evidence and said a balance needed to be struck between the heart and the kidneys. Evidence was discussed as to Dell's state of mind, which devolved into drowsiness and him becoming either comatose or barely rousable, which the professor testified could be a product of the drugs he was given. Returning to these drugs, Dell was administered at least 17.5 milligrams of midazolam. Dell's dose had been doubled during the night, with questions as to whether doctors were consulted as the escalating doses given. An unclear amount was given via faulty syringe driver, with logs of the wastage of the drug erased. The destruction of evidence, the Controlled Substances book, despite the inquest being pursued, and logs which were backdated at the time at which Dell was in hospital, were serious concerns raised by the professor, who stated he was shocked seeing the standard of record keeping. There were also further issues regarding the final form prior to cremation, which mentioned the body was not examined after death due to COVID procedures. Professor Ahmedzai concluded that Mr. Dimmock's death was caused as follows. First, iatrogenic acute intoxication with midazolam, alfentanil, and oxycodone. Second, uncontrolled acute polyarticular gout with suspended vertebral gout. And finally, acute renal failure aggregated by enforced dehydration. Over the course of this case, there have been a number of serious concerns with the court, which have led to a number of reported complaints about the court in this inquest. The inquest continued to be held in Court B, a small room roughly 10 by 14 feet, reminiscent of a personal office. Within the court, a lack of ventilation led to the room becoming hot and airless. The court had room for only 6 individuals in the public gallery, which in reality was nothing but a line of 6 chairs awkwardly pressed into the back of the room. Those kept outside were again expected to watch by video link, which failed to show anything of the court except for the face of the coroner or the witness giving evidence, exclusively. In addition, new restrictions prevented new attendees from joining the case whilst it was ongoing, despite issues with connection. On Tuesday, the live link cut off, depriving those viewing of part of a witness testimony. Meanwhile, the laptop used to operate technicals failed at multiple points. Meanwhile, during Professor Ahmedzai's questioning by Miss Wright-Kluger on behalf of Royal Trinity, he was repeatedly referred to comment on items without reference to the bundle, a practice to which Mr. Bogle, the family's representative, objected. In-person hearings have now concluded, without further delays being allocated for witness testimony. Instead, many of the remaining questions will be submitted in writing without the ability to follow up as in court. Whatever the verdict, wider implications will likely be drawn regarding the widespread use of midazolam, whether during the lockdown period or beyond. For some, this may mark just the tip of the iceberg. I'll be returning in the coming weeks or months for the verdict. This is Will Coleshill, reporting for UK Column.
Okay, thank you to Will for that. So, yes, we'll hear more on that in the coming weeks. Vanessa, let me welcome you back and more on the propaganda that's building around Syria.
Yeah, there's been a very odd building of a narrative, a kind of re-criminalisation of President Assad. And of course, we have to remember he escaped justice from a Western perspective. In other words, he's still alive, unlike, of course, Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, both of whom were done away with by the imperialist Axis. Assad is still alive. So the first, and there are many, I've picked out some of the most prominent ones, but there are many. There is literally a whole tsunami of re-criminalization of Assad. First of all, this is from Reuters. Assad's exiled spy chief and billionaire cousin, which is Rami Makhlouf, who ran the kind of telecom industry in Syria prior to the fall, and Kamal Hassan, his so-called, as they call him, spy chief, plot Syrian uprisings from inside Russia. This is talking about potential for uprisings on the coast. You can read the article for far more detail. And I wonder if this is related to the fact that there is a growing resistance in Syria, basically pushing back against the Jilani atrocities and lack of any accountability or justice in Syria for the victims of the violence carried out by the various foreign takfiris and thugs that belong to Jilani's security forces. This might be, that Reuters article might be setting the narrative to justify further massacres based on the fact that there is this brewing plot to overthrow the Western-imposed president in Syria. That's just my interpretation of that. This is something that has been breaking over the last few days. In Gulf media, there has been the release of videos of President Assad with Luna Shibble, one of his former advisors, basically denigrating various figures in Syria and in the resistance. And then in the last 24 hours, this broke. Al-Mayadeen, Damascus correspondent Rida al-Bashar, has made some bizarre claims regarding Assad being involved in the 2024 assassinations of Hezbollah and IRGC figures in Syria. He also claimed that Assad was involved in the assassination of his own media advisor, Luna al-Shibble, who died in July 2024 in a car accident. Again, this seems to be trying to drive a wedge between really Syria and the resistance in Lebanon and even in Iran, perhaps trying to discredit the resistance in Lebanon for having participated in the war against the collective West, Israel, Turkey, to try and overthrow the Syrian government. Then we bring in Walt Disney. This is Derek Haddad, who was a very popular figure based in Canada, a Syrian origin, allegedly left Syria in 2015. So this is the most exciting project to date. So honored to share the incredible news that our family story is becoming an animated feature film called Chocolate, produced in Hollywood by Rising Tides Film. Extraordinary global team of artists who've worked on some of the most iconic animated films from Disney, DreamWorks, and Sony. So now the criminalization of Assad and the rewriting of history, of course, is going to be Disney-fied. Just a quick look at Tarek Haddad and how deeply embedded he was in Canadian and US echelons of power. Here he is, of course, photographed with President Obama, but he's very embedded into the Canadian political circles. He founded Peace by Chocolate. You can go and look that up, but I don't have anything else to comment on that. And then in the last few days, this organization, which I haven't come across before, ICIJ, has put out an entire thread on X, basically claiming that they have come into possession of documentation. It's a collaboration from ICIJ, NDR, which is a German media company, 24 media partners in a number of countries across the globe. And this was part of their sort of PR video to promote their investigation. So let's have a look at this.
For over a decade, Bashar al-Assad ruled Syria through violence and fear, ordering the disappearance, torture, and murder of tens of thousands of people who opposed his regime. Now, 1 year since Syrian opposition forces overthrew his dictatorship, a team of journalists from around the world has uncovered harrowing new details about his state-run killing machine. The Damascus Dossier, an investigation led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and German broadcaster NDR, sheds new light on the daily operations of al-Assad's surveillance and detention system. Thousands of leaked intelligence files obtained by NDR expose how the regime cooperated with autocratic allies and pressured the United Nations to maintain security contracts that served al-Assad's interests. NDR reporters also obtained one of the largest troves of images of Syrian prisoners tortured and murdered by al-Assad's forces.
So really, I mean, this is just a sort of a rehash of much of the propaganda that was levied against President Assad and the government during the 14-year regime change war. Very quick look that I had at the sponsors of ICIJ or the partners. First of all, National Endowment for Democracy, which of course is nothing more than a deep state outreach agent for the United States. Open Society Foundations, which of course is Soros, well known for interfering in the state affairs of sovereign countries. The UK postcode lottery perhaps might get some comment from you on that in extra. But then if we also look at, and I'm going to conclude with what I think is actually going on, in Russian TASS media, it's been reported again in the last 48 hours. Netanyahu says his regular contacts with Putin are in Israel's interests. What does he actually say? So the actual quote from Netanyahu is that he says, "I speak with President Putin regularly. This should be no surprise to anyone that has been closely following the Russian involvement in Syria. I think between 2015 and 2021, there were around 50 phone calls between Putin and Netanyahu. These decades-long personal ties serve our vital interests. Four powers that Israel has bolstered relations with in the past 2 years: Russia, the US, India, and Germany. An interesting conglomeration there, which we can again discuss more in extra. Then the New York Times has basically been running a witch hunt for a number of weeks now, trying to identify and geolocate members of Assad's government and military that fled 1 year ago, the Vanishing Act, how Assad's top henchmen fled Syria, and justice. Now, I have to say, I find these reports from NYT to be utterly disgusting. They are condemning without any due process. They're rushing to judgment, and effectively they're criminalizing people that have not gone through any form of trial. And of course, what does that do? Again, it justifies the ongoing massacres by Jolani inside Syria by effectively criminalizing those that perhaps still support Assad and what Syria used to be. And then interesting, again, in the last 48 hours in relation to Netanyahu's statement in the Knesset, this has been published in Euronews, but it's also been picked up by Israeli media. 1 year after Syria ouster, al-Assad lives under strict Russian supervision in Moscow. Exile, very different language suddenly being used, particularly by Israeli media that are saying they have sources claiming that Russia is increasing restrictions on Assad and that effectively he's now under house arrest. So I'm wondering, we talked about this, Mike, yesterday, whether this is creating the environment in which Russia can extradite Assad for justice, such as it will be in Syria, because Jolani has been pushing for this since communications began again between Russia and the Takfiri regime in Syria. And again, I think all of these narratives are effectively giving the pretext for the massacres and atrocities to continue in Syria.
Indeed. I think this whole situation is extremely problematic because there is no prospect of there being any justice for the individuals that were highlighted in the New York Times article or for Assad in the current climate. It's just not possible. Let's come back to the UK, Charles, and move on to farming-related issues.
Well, in fact, one that's going to affect large swathes of the world, and Le Monde reporting, as have many mainstream outlets, on the retraction of a paper studying the effects or the safety data around glyphosate. And if you're wondering why that matters, it's because the majority of people do ingest or absorb glyphosate several times a day. Now, the journal in question is the Journal of Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology, and their editor took the decision to withdraw the paper that was initially put out in April 2020, the safety evaluation and risk assessment of the herbicide Roundup and its active ingredient glyphosate for humans, which is that was the title of the original paper. The editor wrote that concerns were raised regarding the authorship of the paper, validity of the research findings in the context of misrepresentation of the contributions by the authors and the study sponsor, and potential conflicts of interest of the authors. And he went on to explain exactly why that was the case, saying that the conclusions regarding the carcinogenity of glyphosate were solely based on unpublished studies from the manufacturer, Monsanto. Further, that it appears from correspondence that employees of Monsanto may have contributed to the writing of the article without proper acknowledgement as co-authors. And among many other points, but this is the last one I've got, the authors may have received financial compensation from Monsanto for their work on this article, which was not disclosed as such in this publication. So it is very significant that this should have been retracted, as I say, because of the very, very widespread application of the herbicide glyphosate. Now, coincident with this is a declaration by United States lawmakers saying they are backing Bayer Monsanto with a decision on exactly this issue. John Sauer, the US Solicitor General, has filed a brief supporting Monsanto's petition for a ruling on whether federal law preempts claims under state laws that the company failed to warn users about Roundup's cancer risk. Now, in the middle of all of this is Robert Kennedy Jr., the current Secretary of State for Health and Human Services, and this is what he had to say about Roundup in a discussion with Joe Rogan.
And then in around 2006, they discovered that if you sprayed it on wheat late in the season, it would desiccate the wheat. In other words, it would dry it out. And one of the big losses for farmers in wheat is if it rains during the harvest season, you can't harvest it because it gets moldy. And so if you can spray a desiccant on it and dries it out and kills it, you can harvest it right away and it won't get moldy. So all the wheat in our country started being sprayed that year in 2006 with glyphosate. And that's the year you saw this explosion of celiac diseases and, gluten allergies and all of this stuff that people, that you may have noticed around then.
But they also did.
The first time they're spraying it directly on food. Because it used to be they were spraying it early in the season. And it would wash off, and the corn would get higher than the weeds, and you wouldn't have to do it. But now they're spraying it directly on our food. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
So that's one of the critical parts there, is that it is sprayed directly onto what subsequently becomes food. And of course, because maximum residue limits are set beyond points that are perhaps realistic, this is of significant concern. Interestingly, also, Kennedy was one of the attorneys for the case of Dwayne Johnson, who was awarded $289 million in a lawsuit against Monsanto going back to 2018. And this has prompted, or at least sorry, if we can just go on one slide, please. I seem to have lost my connection. The Breakthrough initiative there, reporting that they're saying that Kennedy is exactly who they said he was. Effectively, this is the sort of the corporate position, in that whilst we are, on the one hand, supposed to believe that by producing carbon dioxide, we're destroying the climate and the environment, but somehow by putting toxic chemicals into the ground, we're not harming either soil, animal, or human health. So the sort of sense of outrage and politically and commercially funded opposition to this is significant. Now, how do things lie in the United Kingdom? The Pesticides National Action Plan 2025 has been presented as a document that has all of this in check, in control. The situation doesn't seem to be quite like that. We've got the Pesticide Action Network in their review suggesting that highly hazardous pesticides continue to be used within the global supply chains of all of the UK's largest 10 supermarkets, including carcinogens and hormone disruptors, bee toxins, and water contaminants. So something that's likely to continue to cause controversy, but nonetheless, the retraction itself is an extremely significant development for Monsanto and indeed all those using the herbicide and the onward processes.
Thank you for that, Charles. This is a massively interesting topic, so we'll talk about more in extra, no doubt. Now, I just want to end on something that I personally found utterly hilarious because it was this BBC article: trains cancelled over fake bridge collapse image. So trains were halted after a suspected AI-generated picture that seemed to show major damage to a bridge appeared on social media following an earthquake. The BBC article reported, just put it back on screen there if we could, William. The tremor, which struck on Wednesday night, was felt across Lancashire and the Southern Lake District. Network Rail said it was aware of the image, which appeared to show major damage to Carlisle Bridge in Lancaster at midnight 30 GMT, and stopped rail services across the bridge while safety inspections were carried out. A BBC journalist ran the image through an AI chatbot, which identified key spots that may have been manipulated. So let's just sort of put it back on, William. Let's just zoom in on this and have a look at the two images that the BBC published, with the bridge on the left and the AI manipulated image on the right. And this journalist had to go to an AI chat box to identify the problematic areas of the image on the right there. It's quite incredible, Charles. I don't know what where do we start?
Well, I mean, don't we go back to the words of Tony Blair, who says that AI is an absolute gift and it will make all our lives better all the time. Perhaps he was involved.
We do have to leave it there because that's all we have time for today. I'm going to say thank you to Vanessa, Charles, and Will, and to everyone that's watching. Don't forget Germ Warfare and Silk and Steel tonight, and join us for the Salisbury live stream tomorrow beginning at 7:30. Now, I just make the point that Germ's program would normally be going out at 7 o'clock tomorrow, but because we're doing the Salisbury event, that's going to go out at 6. So Germ Warfare will be out at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. Join us for that. We'll see you on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual for another UK Column News. And part of that will be covering more on the Filton 6. We'll see you then. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.